Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Gentreo podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jacob Murphy, and joining me today is our CEO and founder, Renee Fry. Renee, welcome in.
Thank you very much, Jake. Nice to be here.
So you've been on the podcast before, and obviously we talked a lot about estate planning and the estate planning process and a couple of reasons why estate planning is so important to us. But I wanted to talk today about marriage and why estate planning seems to be so misunderstood by married couples and the importance of it for both people in that marriage.
Yeah, it is something that lots of people have crazy assumptions about that we've heard over the past 5 years since we founded Gentreo. Everything from, well, we don't need one because the state's going to cover everything and there are laws and things set in place, which there are, but they're probably not going to help you because you're going to lose a lot of money to courts and lawyers. Or things like, I really think my husband has everything handled, or my wife or my partner. And making those assumptions doesn't always result in what people want and what they want to have happen. So a lot of questions remain unanswered if you don't have estate planning done. And that's why married people really do have to have really discussions about what the choices they want to make and what they want the future to look like when they're not here. Because unfortunately, what do they say? Death and taxes, those are the only two certain things in life. Mm-hmm. It's very true.
So what is the answer to that question? You know, if I'm in a married relationship and I was to pass away, wouldn't my spouse just receive everything?
Depends on the laws of your state. If you don't have a will or a trust, and the state then and the courts decide everything. And especially today with so many blended families, things get really tricky. And while you think certain people are going to be cared for, they may not be cared for. And so really the much safer way to do things is to do your own estate planning and to make the choices yourself.
So what would happen then if one spouse had significantly more assets than the other spouse?
So lots of different things can happen. And that's probably where the lawyers can get involved and things like that. But again, it's one of those things where you want to make the choices. So you want to have the conversations so that you can personally decide, how do you want those assets distributed after one's passing? And especially, again, because there are oftentimes children involved in marriages, making sure that you're taking care of all the folks that you need to take care of, whether it's those children, your spouse, even pets. And so the more complicated things get, if it's an uneven balance or something like that, those are the times when there's a lot of strife. A lot of emails and calls that we get are from folks that, you know, they think their spouse or their partner had the best of intentions, but things weren't written down, and it becomes a very sad story.
So it really is just important for, you know, both members of the couple or of the marriage to get their estate plan specified to them.
Yeah, definitely. Because you may not have the same choices. Right. And so you may have things that, you know, in your will or trust or something that your spouse doesn't have, or maybe things that you brought into the marriage that you want to make sure go specifically to people you choose. And then one of the things that's also important is that while you're alive, estate planning matters as well, too. So whether it's a power of attorney, which is related to financial documents, or it's a power of attorney for healthcare, often called a healthcare proxy, those are documents that are used while you're alive. And so it may be while you're incapacitated, but those are things that you can make choices about today. So for instance, on a healthcare proxy, you may know that your spouse would have a really hard time pulling the plug, as they call it. And so maybe you need to assign that to your brother, who may live 3 states away, but you know that your brother could actually make the decision that if you're incapacitated and there's no chance of your survival, you don't want to be on life support. And those are choices that people need to make. And you need to choose people that can make those decisions that you want made. And so that's why documents like healthcare proxies and powers of attorney matter as well, and especially for married couples, around having those discussions around what are those choices, how do you want choices made, And then how do you empower people to make those choices? Because a lot of people assume that when you're married, everything's all just one big pot. And since so many people today have things in their own name and don't ever make things a joint account, that's not true anymore.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, you've mentioned, the healthcare proxy and the power of attorney, do you think there's any one particular document that's more essential to have for a married couple, or do you think they're all pretty important to have updated for the
Leave that
individual?
up to the folks to decide on their own.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, and really what I can tell you about is that the healthcare proxy is something that's been really important. COVID is still real, right? But
Mm-hmm.
this is where I have specific choices that I want known and made. And so while my sister, who lives with my husband and I, would pull the plug on anyone, I actually would like a shot if there's a chance of me living. And so it's decisions like that you want to make sure people know about. And so that's why I think recently, for me at least, the healthcare proxy has been a little bit more important. And then there are folks too that might think a power of attorney for the financial things is more important because, for instance, if there's one breadwinner in the family, but you haven't merged accounts and something happens to that breadwinner, you all of a sudden may not be able to access any money. And so that's a big problem where we get all kinds of emails and phone calls asking for help. And unfortunately, if they'd had documents in place, they wouldn't be making those phone calls and emails. And the problem is that since documents weren't not in place, a lot of times these folks are having to go to court.
We've established that all three of the documents can be important depending on your specific situation. One thing that I know confuses a lot of people is the difference between a will and a living trust. Can you explain that a little more in depth?
Sure. So a living trust, one of the main reasons that folks choose a living trust is that does not have to go to probate. So when you pass away, if you have a will, and a lot of times you will have a pour-over will with a living trust to make sure that everything is captured, but a will go to the court system and then it becomes public information when it goes through probate. A living trust does not have to do this. So if you want to put assets into a living trust to make sure that they're kept private and that somehow the world now doesn't have to know that you gave your antique car to your cousin and you gave a 4-carat diamond ring to your sister, that's something you want to put into a trust because that's not going to be public information. If you put those items in a will after you go through probate and things like that, it all of a sudden it's public information. So now people know that those folks inherited those items.
So there's an aspect of privacy to it.
Yeah, I think that's for me, I think that would be the biggest choice and the difference in that regard. And I think from a privacy perspective, it's really making sure too that that as your life changes, you can always update your documents. So whether it's your will or it's your living trust, if you have different choices that you want to make throughout your life, the reason that Gentreo, we never charge for updates is because relationships change. The people in your life may change. And so some of those decisions are going to change as well. So in this part of your life, you may not want things to be public information after you pass away, but maybe 10 years from now, you may not care. And so it's giving choices and options to people so that choices are going to fit where they are in their lives today and really where they think they're going to go, but at the same time giving the option to make different choices later if they need to.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of people changing choices, I suppose, how would couples approach estate planning if they have children from a previous marriage?
Yeah, so this is something where Gentreo will walk you through all of these things, but it might be that you have to name specific beneficiaries. You want to make sure that the more things that you put in writing often is better. And so you want to make sure that you're making those choices by making those choices known.
As we've established, there's a couple different a couple different choices to make during the actual process of creating your estate plan, but what about updating and revising it? So let's start with how often should couples review and update their estate plan?
So lawyers will often tell you every 3 to 5 years. We at Gentreo suggest taking a look every year, doing an annual review, just to make sure that nothing in your life has changed that you might want to reflect in your estate plan. And especially as relationships change, if you get remarried or you're getting a divorce, those life inflection points are times that really call for a need to review your estate planning documents, because now you may not want someone to inherit your home that you had chosen, or that person, or maybe making healthcare decisions. You want someone else now to make those decisions for you. So it's really about understanding where you are in relationships, and maybe new things are happening too, like a baby or something like that. But really making sure that wherever you are in your life, your estate plan reflects that.
And what would be some of the consequences that you've heard or exist if, and specifically talking about a married couple right now, if they were not to have their estate plan either in place or updated correctly, or if only one of the spouses had it?
Yeah, so there was a story going around where a gentleman out of New York who was rather wealthy had never updated his estate plan, and so his second wife inherited everything, and his third and current wife got nothing. And it was because none of the paperwork in his estate plan just hadn't been updated, and so there was really nothing they could do, because the estate plan said this person gets everything, and there was nothing written about the next spouse. And so since all that was already in writing, that's what held up.
And of course, it doesn't even matter that he completely remarried.
That's up to the courts and things like that. And I'm sure they went and fought about that. But I know that unfortunately, it was a story that was going around quite a bit.
Yeah. And as we know, even if the courts were to uphold, his decisions, that's still time and money spent in the court, which is something
that's
you
right.
always want to avoid.
Which is it's expensive, and those things last years and destroy relationships. It just the cost. It's the cost of money, the time, relationships. And this is why having everything up to date and prepared really can save you a lot more than just money, but relationships too.
So when it comes to digital assets and, modern considerations, how should couples handle, their digital assets and accounts when it comes to, estate planning for married couples?
So those are typically assets. And so they need to make sure that those are listed as well, if that's something they choose to do. For instance, a lot of times people today don't merge bank accounts, stock trading accounts, things like that. And so you really need to make sure that those are somehow known about. Sometimes people, and this may not be it may be that you inherit those things, but you may not even know what you're inheriting, because so many people have digital things that they aren't sharing. Like I have a couple of friends that have day trading accounts that they just play with. But I've asked them, does anybody know about this? Does your wife know? Does your husband know? Does your partner know? And a lot of times they're like, no, this is just, I play with this sometimes, and no. And then the answer is, okay, well, when something happens, how are they going to know that money's there? And you often get a blank stare of people saying, oh, that's interesting. So one of the things that we suggest in the Gentreo Vault is that you put that information there so people know that these accounts may exist, there may be assets there, and how to get into those accounts as well. There's a lot of stories of people who had Bitcoin and other things that just got lost to the ether because no one knew how to get there. Cryptocurrency, things like that.
So it's important, I feel like people are pretty caught in the moment when it comes, especially, today with all the, I'm sure you've seen all the sports betting advertisements all throughout Massachusetts. Now that that's legal, those accounts they can hold money in them. So people may think that, that money is still theirs, but if it's in the account and no one can get to it, that could be lost assets that people don't really consider.
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. And again, it you may inherit it. You may never know that it's there.
Yeah, so it's important to list that out. Final question I want to ask you before we wrap up this episode, because I know we have you scheduled to come back and talk about this question a little more, but since it does apply to our marriage topic today, I thought I'd ask you it just to give a little preview. But how is estate planning for couples important when it comes to protecting their children?
So from the children's perspective, enough can't be said because they're minors. They aren't making the decisions. So the courts need to make the decisions. So this is where if you have everything in writing and your T's crossed and your I's dotted, you're making things a lot easier, where you would assume that things could, should go easily. But, assumptions probably sometimes are wrong. And so you want to make sure that putting things in writing, making sure that you're sharing your thoughts, your wishes, your beliefs, all of that is critical, because while so many people today really haven't done estate planning, they're putting decisions in the hands of the courts and the state. And sometimes, unfortunately, if both parents pass away at the same time and there's no plan left in place, those decisions then are made by the court, and families can go to war. And it's, if people want, one side may want the children, the other side may want the children. And this is how families and things are all torn apart. This is how families really just get lost. And so in the system, so it's something that really is critical. And if you have any questions, there's tons of blogs and things that you can read on Gentreo. Our lawyers have put together some fantastic things that really talk about what are these critical decisions that need to be made, and giving you tips and pointers on how to think about these decisions, because there is a thought process that needs to be going through these things. Everybody talks about, wow, it's so fast. You can do a will in 20 minutes, which sure you can, but these are really thoughtful decisions that you need to be making, because none of us think anything's ever going to happen to us, but there's always a chance, right? And so since that exists, having those conversations, being thoughtful, and making sure that your partner is sharing in making those decisions for themselves is just as important, because if you're not there, you want to make sure that that choices have been made on their side as well.
Plenty to talk about when it comes to protecting your children, obviously. So, like I said, Renee, we're going to have you back on to tackle that topic in a little more detail. But for today, thank you very much for coming on, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope we were able to explain in a little more detail, because it is a little confusing sometimes why estate planning for the individual, even if you're married, super important, needs to get done.
Yeah, no, and one last thing I'll leave you with is that some people assume that they could have one will together, and some very, very few states do allow that. But given that no one dies exactly at the same time, and it's mostly illegal in both states, everyone needs to think about getting their own will, because it really is something that choices that you want to make sure are being made in most cases.
Well, Renee, we will see you very soon for the Protecting Your Children podcast. But for now, thank you very much for being on. And everyone listening, we hope you have gotten something good out of this.